quiet, deliberate.
20 seconds. That was all the time left before a terminal impact would have changed the course of history in the Strait of Hormuz. One inbound missile had survived the layered defenses of the strike group, hugging the sea so low it was almost invisible to radar. On the bridge of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the silence was absolute as 5,000 souls waited for the inevitable. Then the 6-barrel Gatling guns of a nearby destroyer screamed to life, shredding the dawn with a stream of tungsten. A mile from the carrier's bow, the horizon erupted into a violent orange fireball. The ship did not just survive an attack, it was about to unleash a counterstrike that would erase the very hands that pulled the trigger. That last contact was inside the range where nobody mistakes procedure for comfort. It was a countdown to a potential disaster. The surviving track was no longer just a symbol, it was a physical threat moving at incredible speed. The escort destroyer closest to the carrier did not wait for orders. Its forward-mounted gun system opened fire, the 6 barrels spinning up with a mechanical shriek that echoed across the water. A stream of tungsten tore through the air, and the sea ahead of the formation erupted in a line of splashes. A fraction of a second later, the inbound missile burst apart less than a mile from the bow, scattering burning debris across the waves. The bridge windows of the Abraham Lincoln trembled from the shock of the explosion. No one on board called it a near miss, but everyone knew how close they had come to a different outcome. While sailors on the flight deck were still watching black fragments fall into the Gulf, a new problem emerged on the surface search radar. Fast contacts were building much closer to the waterline. Small, high-speed hulls were emerging from separate bearings near the Iranian coast, converging on the strike group like a hand beginning to close. The missile ambush had just evolved into a layered surface assault, and the danger was far from over. At 5:22, the strike group found itself trapped in one of the narrowest and most sensitive waterways on Earth. 10 fast attack craft were moving with purpose, forcing the American operators to split their focus. Some were just posturing, but others were moving into attack geometry. One of the destroyers shifted outward, placing its hull between the carrier and the closing swarm. It was a quiet, deliberate protective maneuver designed to widen the kill zone. On the bridge, the captain gave the order to warn them once. Bridge-to-bridge transmissions went out on open channels, telling the Iranian craft they were closing unsafely and must alter course. There was no reply. The boats kept coming, their bows rising as they accelerated across the water. Through long-range optics, they looked small against the vastness of the Gulf morning, but the sailors watching them knew better than to underestimate them. Speedboats armed with rockets or mines can start a fire on a crowded flight deck that can be just as deadly as a missile. It does not take a massive cruiser to cripple a carrier, it only takes one opening and one mistake. At 5:23, the roar of rotor blades filled the air as an MH-60 Seahawk was brought fully awake, its crew sprinting through the startup sequence to get eyes on the swarm. By 5:24, the Seahawk lifted off the deck and banked hard over the formation. From the air, the coordination of the attack became clear. 2 Iranian boats were staying wide to distract the escorts, while 3 others were driving inward at high speed. Another boat trailed behind, likely acting as a command and control node. One of the lead boats suddenly increased its speed, its wake forming a sharp white sheet as it crossed the threshold from pressure to an undeniable threat. Inside the Combat Information Center, the report was immediate. The lead craft was accelerating and showing signs of weapons preparation. The time for warnings had officially passed. The screening destroyer trained its 5-inch gun on the lead craft, not yet firing but showing its intent. When the Iranian boat refused to brake, the destroyer acted. A sharp warning burst slammed into the water ahead of the boat, throwing up a massive wall of spray that could be seen from the carrier's flight deck. It was a final message: brake now or be destroyed. The boat did not flinch. At 5:26, the destroyer fired for effect. The first rounds landed near the bow and walked directly into the hull. Through the helicopter feed, sailors watched the boat shudder as it was ripped apart, smoke rising as it went dead in the water. The 2 trailing boats reacted instantly, veering away to escape the same fate, but the electronic warfare operators were focused on something else entirely. During the surface rush, they had detected multiple narrow emissions from the Iranian coastline. These were not random signals. They were fire control quality transmissions. It became clear that the boats were never the primary weapon. They were the distraction, a moving piece meant to hold American eyes forward while someone on the shore prepared the next shot. The suspicion hardened when the Hawkeye pushed new data into the network. Mobile anti-ship systems were operating from hidden coastal sites. The pivot happened at 5:27. The captain of the Abraham Lincoln heard the report and did not hesitate. He ordered the identification of the launch corridor and the preparation of counterstrike options. Up until this point, the carrier had been absorbing the blows, screening the threats, and intercepting the missiles. Now the center of gravity shifted. The ship was no longer just defending itself. It was preparing to reach back across the water and cut the hand that had thrown the punch. The flight deck, which had been frozen in defensive posture, suddenly exploded into a controlled, urgent rhythm of offensive preparation. Yellow shirts re-established taxi lanes while red shirts moved ordnance with practiced speed. An EA-18G Growler was brought forward to the catapult, a sign that the next phase would involve blinding the enemy's sensors and breaking their command links. Around it, Super Hornets were being loaded with precision-guided munitions. The air wing was not launching into a vacuum. They were heading toward a battle space that had already shown its teeth. Even as they prepared to launch, a subsurface alert briefly pinged on the sonar, a reminder that the attack could have a third layer. It faded, but the tension remained at a breaking point. At 5:31, the first American strike aircraft were over the water, heading toward the Iranian shore. They did not rush in blindly. They built a digital picture of the battlefield first. The Growler led the way, using its electronic warfare suite to distort coastal search radars and turn the enemy's tracking beams into useless noise. On the ground, the Iranian batteries likely saw their screens flicker and fade as the invisible pressure of American technology began to collapse their ability to fight. Hesitation inside a missile battery is the first step toward total failure, and the Americans were about to exploit every second of that confusion. The crisis began at exactly 5:17 local time. It did not start with a scream or a loud explosion, but with a flat, mechanical pulse inside the Combat Information Center. Radar operators watched in stunned silence as three fast-moving contacts broke away from the Iranian coastline, dropping so low they began to blur into the sea clutter. This was not a drill or a routine patrol crossing paths. The tactical action officer called it out with a chilling brevity: possible anti-ship profiles, multiple bearings, and they were closing fast. In an instant, the routine of a massive floating city vanished, replaced by the cold, calculated machinery of a 100,000-ton target. By 5:33, the first target was confirmed, a mobile radar system tucked near a launch corridor. It was partially concealed, but the targeting pods on the Super Hornets saw the heat signatures of the military vehicles. The strike lead called out the identification, and the first guided bomb was released. Seconds later, the shoreline flashed orange as the radar vehicle disappeared inside a blooming cloud of debris. The kill chain that had started the morning's violence was being systematically dismantled. A second site was found farther east, this one a launcher position hidden behind camouflage netting, and the Americans were not going to let it survive. The second strike was even more violent. When the precision steel hit the launcher site, a massive secondary explosion punched upward, followed by a rolling column of black smoke. That was the sound of missile fuel and ammunition cooking off. Whatever had been parked there was gone. The strike package then shifted south, hunting for the command node that had coordinated the entire assault. They found it near a low ridgeline, where a cluster of vehicles and a communications mast were trying to retract. One final attack followed, and the command post was swallowed by dust and smoke. The Iranian network was no longer a coherent threat. By 5:42, the smoke had shifted from the water to the coastline. The USS Abraham Lincoln continued its transit, its bow carving through the water as if the morning had been entirely routine. On the flight deck, the arresting gear crews were already preparing to recover the returning jets. There was no cheering, just the quiet focus of professionals who knew exactly how close they had come to the edge. 5,000 people had started the day as targets, but they were ending it in control. The system had worked, not because it was untouchable, but because every sailor, pilot, and operator had functioned as a single, disciplined machine. The Strait of Hormuz looked deceptively normal by 5:50 a.m., but the message sent that morning was unmistakable. Iran had not just fired at a symbol, it had challenged a living, breathing system designed to survive the first blow and deliver the last one. The debris field drifting astern of the carrier was a physical reminder of the cost of that challenge. Control of the waterway had not been maintained through luck, but through the brutal efficiency of American doctrine. As the jets trapped back onto the deck and the sun finally rose, the uncertainty of the morning belonged entirely to the enemy. The carrier group had held the line. Below the flight deck, 5,000 sailors and Marines were suddenly living inside a bullseye. The USS Abraham Lincoln is the center of a strike group, a fortress wrapped in steel, but in the narrow confines of the strait, space is a luxury. Ahead and off her quarters, 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers were already reacting to the threat. Their Aegis systems swept the horizon, pulling those low-flying ghosts out of the haze and building firing solutions before most of the carrier's crew even knew they were in the line of fire. It was a race between software and speed, with the lives of thousands of Americans hanging in the balance of a computer's calculation. By 5:18, the tactical picture turned from bad to worse. An E-2D Hawkeye orbiting high above the formation confirmed the nightmare scenario that the ship's sensors were starting to suspect. These were not just stray contacts or a mistake, they were missile-class tracks, flying fast and coordinated. Even more alarming was the second flicker on the long-range sensors farther inland. Launch signatures were blooming one after another. This was not a single shot designed to test their nerves. This was a package. A layered, synchronized assault designed to overwhelm the carrier's defenses and find a single opening that would lead to a catastrophic impact. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that moved like electricity through the passageways. Range numbers counted down in hard, unforgiving digits. Bearings updated every second as closure rates tightened. There was no shouting and there were no grand speeches. Emotion wastes time that these sailors simply did not have. On the bridge, the captain kept his voice level, ordering the ship to maintain course while the escorts engaged the threat. Sailors on internal comms repeated the word inbound over and over, their voices stripped of feeling because every second spent panicking was a second lost to the enemy. At 5:19, the first American interceptors left their rails. Far off the starboard bow, a destroyer fired a pair of SM-2 missiles in quick succession, their launches blooming white against the pale morning sky before they disappeared into pure speed. A second destroyer followed suit, cutting the horizon with another pair of streaks. From the carrier's island, sailors looked out and saw brief flashes of light cutting upward before they flattened toward the distance. The escorts were firing at ranges that felt uncomfortably close, a clear sign that the situation had become very real very quickly. The deck was no longer a place of launch, it was a place of survival. The first kill came almost immediately, but it provided no relief. One inbound missile disappeared in a distant flash, so far away it barely seemed connected to the carrier at all. It was just a white spark followed by a fragment cloud, then nothing. The ship's computers logged the track as destroyed, but there was no time to celebrate. 2 more were still coming, and they were accelerating. Electronic warfare teams aboard the escorts began flooding the battle space with jamming and deception signals. They were trying to break the missile's terminal picture, throwing out enough digital noise to ensure the weapons could never find the massive hull of the carrier. The clock hit 5:20, and the temperature aboard the ship seemed to change. One of the remaining tracks dropped even lower, vanishing into the sea clutter for 3 agonizing seconds. The radar operators stopped sounding clinical. Their voices became sharper, more urgent. Those 3 seconds felt longer than the entire morning combined. Every eye in the CIC was searching for that return, waiting for the ghost to reappear. When it finally did, it was closer and still very much alive. The Aegis system recalculated instantly, and another interceptor launched, while the white domes of the close-in weapon systems began slewing with cold, mechanical intent. As the range collapsed, the sound of the ship changed. Sailors on the upper levels heard the distinct, high-pitched whine of defensive systems coming alive. It is the kind of sound that means the last layer of protection is preparing to work, and if it fails, there is nothing left but steel and luck. On the bridge, the captain watched the tactical repeater as the carrier held its formation. There was no turn and no visible panic, just a massive warship driving forward through the waterway while software and timing raced to kill the threat. At 5:21, another flash broke over the water as a second missile was intercepted, but one contact remained.